You shoot for the stars if it feels right and in for my heart. If you feel like can take me away and make it okay, I swear I'll behave. You wanted control, sure we waited, I put on a show. Now I make it, you say I'm a kid. My ego is big, I don't give a. And it goes like this. Take me by the tongue and I'll know you. Kiss me till you're drunk and I'll show you. You got the moves like Jagger. I want the moves like Jagger. Want the moves like Jagger. I don't even try to control you. Look into my eyes and I'll own you. You with the moves like Jagger. I got the moves like Jagger. I got the moves like Jagger. Welcome, welcome, welcome to another episode of the Unrelenting Alchemist. We're talking about the global history of caste divisions in India and other places. I want to talk to you about the origins of stratification in many ancient societies. In India, we have the Vedic genesis of Varna, and this is the earliest textual reference to caste-like division in India, which is found in the Rig Veda, particularly in the Purusha Sukta, which mythologizes the origin of society into four Varnas. We have the Brahmins, who are the priests. We have the Kshatriyas, which are the rulers and the warriors. We have the Vaishyas, which are the merchants, the traders, and the farmers. And we have the Shudras, which are the laborers. And of course, you still have the Dalits, who are the oppressed. And so this became a form of birth entrenched hereditary caste that many people start to fall into. And you find just across the world that many early civilizations arose based on function, religion, or lineage. In Mesopotamia, you have your distinctions which emerged between nobles, priests, free men, and slaves. In ancient Egypt, you had pharaohs at the top, followed by priests, scribes, artisans, and enslaved workers. In China's Shang dynasty, society was divided amongst nobles, warriors, artisans, and peasants. While none of these systems mirrored the complexity of India's Varna Jati matrix, they still share the feature of social roles being inherited and even sometimes spiritualized through cosmology or some sort of sense of spiritual mandate. And so these hierarchies over the BCE periods from 1000 to 200 BCE, you have that by the end of the Vedic period in India, the Brahmanical elite had consolidated social control through religious codes. The Manu Smriti, which prescribed these birth-based statuses, these dietary restrictions, these marriage prohibitions, these notions of ritual purity. You have communities outside the Varnas, later termed the Dalits, which I referred to earlier, and these were like the untouchable castes. These were basically not even the mentionables or anything of worth because they didn't even fall into one of the four systems or classes that were here. These endogamous groups organized around this hereditary occupation, smiths, weavers, barbers, which multiplied the social stratification beyond the fourfold model. And in terms of parallels, you can look at social orders in many classical civilizations. You have Greece and Rome, which had slave-based societies. Although democracy wasn't hereditary in the Indian sense, legal distinctions between citizens, freedmen, and slaves echoed caste-like immobility. Even though we look to the Greeks and the Romans for ideas of democracy and a republic, the reality is that most people couldn't vote. You had to be of a certain class within the caste system in Greece or Rome in order to be able to vote. That there were other groups that were just simply laborers that didn't have that privilege. In Zhou, China, you have a hierarchy of rulers, warriors, artisans, and peasants, with strict ancestral rituals distinguishing noble lineages from the commoners. These civilizations used legal, moral, and religious justifications for social rank, although none really institutionalized pollution-based exclusion to the degree that's seen in Indian caste society. In other words, the Indian caste society is actually probably one of the most harshest and the most complex of systems to emerge around the world. In India, you had Buddhism, Jainism, Bhakti, and the 6th century BCE marked a pivotal turn with the rise of Buddhism and Jainism, both of which explicitly rejected caste hierarchy. Siddhartha Gautama and Mahavira preached about spiritual liberation being accessible to all, irrespective of birth. Monastic orders accepted followers from every background, disrupting the idea of this inherited spiritual superiority. In later centuries, you have the Bhakti movement, which rose across India, marked by saints such as Akka Mahadavi, Basavana, Kabir, and Mirabai. These poet mystics denounced the caste system as being antithetical to divine love, asserting that union with the divine required no intermediary or social validation. In terms of parallels, you have moral and religious reforms abroad. You have Confucius in China, who emphasized virtue and merit over birth and station, subtly undermining aristocratic elitism. You have Lao Tzu and Taoism, which embraced humility, naturalness, egalitarian harmony, resisting any type of hierarchical rigidity. In the Middle East, you have emerging monotheistic traditions that taught spiritual equality before God. Though hereditary priesthoods and ethnic hierarchies did persist to some degree, you have sort of a lessening of that. You had in classical Greece, you had philosophers like the Cynics and the Stoics that preached the equality of all rational beings, challenging the civic stratification I spoke of earlier with the whole class system there that then determined who had the right to vote and who didn't have the right to vote, who had the right to own property and who didn't have the right to own property. In medieval institutionalization between 600 to 1200 CE, you have India having these regional kingdoms and religious orders. And as political power disfragmented into these regional kingdoms, in medieval India, caste was adapted into many local conditions. Temples became economic and social centers controlled by the upper castes. Caste divisions were now visible in architecture, food practices, and even village layouts. Hereditary jatis multiplied and became increasingly rigid. These are the ones who are sort of like almost outside of the system. The spiritual resistance flourished. Saints like Akka Mahadavi, a 12th century Kannada poet, stripped herself of caste and gender norms, choosing total surrender to her deity over any idea of social conformity. She abandoned her husband. She renounced many things of the world, and she continued to defy caste with her form of spiritual transcendence. In Europe, you have feudalism. The feudal system placed nobles, clergies, peasants, and serfs in legally defined positions. Serfs who were tied to the land passed on their status to their children. In Japan, you have the Shinokosho class system, samurai, peasants, artisans, merchants. They became hereditary under the Tokugawa shogunate, and I'm talking about Ieyasu Tokugawa in particular. You have the Tang and Song dynasties in China that developed a powerful bureaucracy based on exams, and landed elites monopolized education, thereby preserving this hereditary privilege and practice, even though it went by another name. You have these geographic and cultural differences across the world where systems are developed that status is inherited and legally enforced. And though the Indian system remained unique in its emphasis, there is still some sort of metaphysical pollution that's going on there. You have cultural synthesis and hierarchical resilience occurring between 1200 CE to 1750 CE. Islamic rule introduced some new dynamics to Indian society. While Islamic theology espoused equality among believers, social hierarchies adopted and adapted and merged with local structures. The Mughal emperors often employed upper caste Hindus in administration, but also patronized Sufi saints who worked among the lower castes and the marginalized groups. You have Sufi and Bhakti movements which overlapped, offering spaces where caste boundaries were blurred. Shrines, poetry, and communal music allowed interaction across social lines, though Orthodox groups often resisted many of these egalitarian influences. The global trend that's emerging is that you have these hierarchies that are religiously backed. So you have the Ottoman Empire that utilized a layered system where ethnic and religious communities, millets had autonomy, but social mobility was extremely limited outside of the military administrative elite. In Imperial China, the Confucian scholar bureaucrat class maintained dominance, despite the theory of a meritocracy existing in examinations. But again, because of their status, they were able to score high on these examinations and thereby remain in this noble family status. All these systems illustrate that the link between heredity, labor, and sacred authority was not unique to India. India developed a far more extensive and far more brutal and internalized version of it that made India legendary for it. But there were many systems across the world that mirrored this, even if not at the same complexity. Between 1750 and 1947, you have the British census, and legal entrenchment. The British East India Company, which is a major corporation, followed by the Crown, transformed caste from a local lived identity into a rigid administrative category. Starting with the census of 1871, the British classified castes across the subcontinent, freezing what had often been flexible or contested social roles. Administrative convenience led to the creation of official lists of martial races or criminal tribes and occupational castes. These designations disrupted traditional livelihoods and reified social divisions. Even reformist efforts from the colonial side often failed to understand the religious depth of caste or the ways in which local reformers were already addressing the issue. Elsewhere, we have colonial hierarchies globally. In Africa, you had colonial powers that created artificial ethnic categories and privileged certain groups over others to facilitate governance, leading to lasting divisions. I know in the Caribbean, you had the 128 degrees of blackness that was used as a colorism way to keep certain classes formalized. In Burma and Malaya and Indonesia, you had so many systems that had rigid caste systems. In Latin American, even systems, you have Spaniards at the top and indigenous and African peoples subjected to legally sanctioned discrimination based on ancestry. The colonial tendency to classify, control, and codify local hierarchies was universal, but in India, this intersected with a pre existing and deeply ingrained religious caste structure which magnified its effects. We have now these post independence realignments and modern persistence of these class systems. In India, you have constitutional abolition and political realignment. In 1950, India's constitution abolished the untouchability and the prohibited discrimination, which now was no longer allowed to exist based on caste. But still, even with these frameworks, you're trying to uplift these historically oppressed groups, now officially termed the scheduled caste or the scheduled tribes, and the other backward classes. These designations are trying to promote equity in education, employment, political representation. But with centuries of this going on, caste remains deeply embedded in social behavior in India. Endogamy, village hierarchy, political mobilization around caste identity still persists to this day. While urbanization and education have opened new pathways, discrimination and caste-based violence still occur, particularly in rural areas. Child brides and forced marriages, dowries. A lot of these things still exist. In Japan, you have the Burakumin, which is a socially stigmatized group associated with certain occupations, and they face centuries of exclusion, even going into the modern era. In Rwanda, their colonial influenced Hutu Tutsi divisions, though ethnic, were partially constructed and reinforced through systems resembling caste dynamics. In Somalia, you have the Sab and the Noble clan divisions that created this rigid social order, where some groups were traditionally barred from intermarriage or even religious leadership. These examples show that while the language of caste may be unique to South Asia, the phenomenon of birth based hereditary social exclusion exists in diverse cultures all across the world. And so these contemporary challenges that we now face are that caste like systems are under siege and increasing scrutiny across the globe. International human rights groups have highlighted the plight of marginalized communities who are subjected to these inherited forms of discrimination. In India, the Dalit and the lower caste movements have asserted cultural pride and political agency, trying to take back their power. The mass media, internet access, and social mobility are disrupting traditional rigid systems and blurring the boundaries, even as backlash from entrenched groups continue. At the same time, caste identities are evolving. In some contexts, they do serve as vehicles for empowerment and collective solidarity rather than exclusion. You have these political mobilizations. You have the revivalism of certain cultures and their core beliefs. You have demands for dignity, which reflect a desire to abolish not just identity, but to transcend the oppressive limitations. Across the world, you have similar movements that exist among historically marginalized groups who are seeking recognition, they're seeking restitution, they're seeking social transformation, whether in rural India, in East Africa, in East Asia. The caste like exclusion reverberates, but it is being challenged by the present. And what has existed for centuries in history is under siege. Caste in India is indeed unique to its spiritual foundations, its elaborate codification, and its historical continuity. Yet the practice of dividing human beings into hereditary ranks based on labor, lineage, or ritual purity is not just confined to India. From the feudal estates of Europe to the occupational minorities of East Asia, societies across the world have created these hierarchies that mirror, echo, or resonate with caste. So this worldwide phenomenon may have different forms, but you can see the patterns: the inherited privilege, the sacred justification, the intergenerational and hereditary exclusion. Just as caste was challenged by saints, reformers, mystics, and revolutionaries in India, you have similar voices that are rising in other cultures to question injustice and proclaim some sort of human equality. The future of caste and caste-like systems depends not only on reform and cultural transformation and ethical reflection, but a collective willingness to move beyond the inherited cages of identity. India's experience offers a cautionary tale and a hopeful wisdom and vision for the future for emancipation across the world. And so, as we end our discussion on this, just remember, collective, I appreciate you. You're all children of God. You're worthy beyond measure. No enemy, no shadow, no storm can remove the divine imprint upon your soul. You carry within you the breath of the sacred, the light of resilience, and the fire of purpose. You're not here by accident. Your presence is medicine. You're a volunteer soul. Your voice is a key. Your heart is a compass. So even when you're surrounded by enemies and you're surrounded by resistance, you're surrounded by all sorts of isms, you were born with the grace to rise. You have the strength to heal, and you have the wisdom to shine. The world truly needs your gifts, and so let no force try to convince you otherwise. You are blessed, you are chosen, you are powerful. Regardless of where you were born in life and where you're going, you walk forward knowing that heaven is behind you. Your ancestors and an army of angels are behind you. Thank you for joining me in this sacred hour. This has been the Unrelenting Alchemist. Until next time, as always, walk wisely, walk bravely, and when the dark calls, answer not with fear, but with boldness, fire, and light. And if I don't see you, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. I love you.